we are. Does everybody have us?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Amy Simon, and I'm here with David Rosen, and we're representing the LGBT Senior Housing and Care Foundation as two of its board members. We are also partners in a educational company called LGBT Senior Housing and Care, which is the major educational vendor for the foundation. And what we do is train anyone who comes in contact, who has a touch point with the senior services community in LGBTQ plus affirming and welcoming practices and protocols, and how to engage without fear, and with supports for the LGBTQ plus community as they age. We're very excited to follow up our speaker from the Department of Health and Human Services and tell you about legislation that Governor Murphy signed in order to require LGBTQ plus training for all of our state's long-term care communities, which is really exciting. So I'm going to turn this over to David Rosen, who will share his background and credentials and talk to you about the bill and why it's important to be trained in LGBTQ practices today. David?
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Rosen. My pronouns are he, him, and you'll see there on my Zoom screen as one of the ways that you can help to create a more affirming environment for the LGBTQ plus community that you may work with. When it comes to the LGBTQI plus population, in New Jersey, there is an increasing number of LGBTQ older adults residing here in the state. And the state recognized that this trending towards an aging population was going to impact the long-term care facilities around the state. And so several years ago, they passed legislation mandating that the long-term care facilities create a mechanism for training all of the providers and staff of the facilities on both LGBTQI plus and HIV positive care protocols to make certain that there's equity in the way care is delivered. Could you go to the next slide? So the trainings that are mandated require terminology so that the facilities staff will all learn the terms commonly associated with ideas about sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, intersex status, and HIV, as well as best practices for communicating with or about LGBTQI seniors and seniors living with HIV, and workarounds and tips, strategies for how providers can work within institutional biases. So institutional bias is really about legacy concerns. If you have the way the world is changing so rapidly, it's sometimes difficult to get our systems to play catch up. So for instance, today, you may have heard something called non-binary as a gender identity. And none of our documents really have been designed to offer genders other than male and female. And so if you are a non-binary individual, you have no box to check off when you're doing an intake. And it's very difficult to get electronic health record systems changed. IT is not always, easy to maneuver to get these things done. So part of this training is actually to help organizations figure workarounds. When you know you can't fix the electronic health record, what can you do instead? So we take people through those best practices. Then what we do is talk about the history of bias and discrimination that have led to health disparities. There's reasons why research that has been conducted nationally, but also here in New Jersey. We have actually several social workers in faculty positions down at Monmouth University and Stockton that have done research on older populations in the LGBTQ plus community and their worries about going into long-term care. And so New Jersey is on one of the forefronts of that research. And what we're finding is that people are concerned as to whether they will have to go back into the closet, or if they are not out, that they won't be able to spend their later years coming out in these facilities without facing discrimination. So we talk about that history and help people to understand why you may have to do some additional tasks in order to make a more affirming environment for seniors. And so what are those strategies to establish it? So we provide, again, these tips, these tools that organizations can then implement. And so this training legislation was designed essentially to make certain that that there's the maximal potential for these LGBTQ residents to be able to feel comfortable coming out or remaining out while they are living in these facilities. Next slide. So when you're thinking about the legislation, NJS 2545 is the actual legislation that talks about that. They require training every 2 years, and there have to be 2 identified members within every organization that's going to one from administration and one from the clinical services. So that way, these 2 individuals have a more of a comprehensive snapshot of the way the facility is run. There's differences between those with admin backgrounds versus those with clinical backgrounds. And while they themselves do not deliver the training, you have to find a vendor to do such training, such as LGBT Senior Housing and Care, but there are other vendors that do it. They are the ones that would find these training entities, determine who needs to be trained in what order within the community of providers at the facility, and then track to make certain that all the credentialing is kept up to date. And so that way, if the health department or the Office of the Long-Term Care Ombudsperson checks to see if they're following the legislation, it will be their responsibility to be able to demonstrate that. Next slide. So why training now? It really has to do with the numbers. 7.1% of adult Americans, approximately up to 23 million, openly identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in the country. 2.7 million are 50 and older. So what we're really expecting is a larger and larger influx as the baby boom generation moves and transitions into their senior years. The need for LGBTQ affirming protocols will rapidly increase because the baby boom generation is really the first generation that has spent most of their adult lives openly identifying as LGBTQ plus. And so their expectation is that this will continue as they enter these facilities. We want to make certain that as the numbers keep rising and rising, that the facilities aren't left, caught unawares and unable to actually provide the care that's necessary. When you look at the percentage of the LGBTQ plus population by state, New Jersey and the surrounding tri-state area of New York and Pennsylvania really have significant numbers of LGBTQ plus individuals. And so it really behooves us to take advantage of this legislation, which essentially gives cover to organizations that may be unsure how welcome it would be to introduce this type of training. Well, now they have the state backing it, saying you have to do it. And that's only going to be good in the long run for creating community buy-in and the buy-in of key stakeholders for each of these types of organizations. Next slide. One of the things to understand is that getting old does actually create challenges. We've talked about the issues of loss and isolation during the first breakout session, depending upon what breakout room you went into. And so emotional health issues, memory loss, fear, it transcends all socioeconomic, race, and cultural boundaries. Knowing that this is part of the process of aging in this country, add on the history of marginalization of the LGBTQ plus community, you end up magnifying these fears and challenges for this particular population that require additional strategies to overcome barriers at a time when people are feeling incredibly vulnerable. As we lose agency, it really becomes difficult to trust. You have to rely on other people when you've spent so many years being self-reliant. And so some older adults may desire and feel that the safest thing for them to do is to go back in the closet in order to avoid discrimination, shame, and violence. And that hurts everyone. It hurts the community because they're not being their authentic selves. It means that no one's getting to see their real personalities and be able to really experience the social friendships and the value that older adults bring to our lives. Their histories get hidden, and then they're cardboard cutouts rather than real people that we can engage with and get to know. So by having them come out and stay out, we really get an authentic picture. They themselves get to be who they are. They get to bring other people along as the boat rises, that other people get to meet LGBTQ plus individuals. Remember, the others in the community may not know very many LGBTQ plus people because the age population that are in the facilities didn't necessarily have large numbers of out LGBTQ plus people. And so these are opportunities for community growth. We need to be thinking about housing, long-term care, but also home care. So there's right now legislation pending to introduce similar legislation in order to expand it into senior service providers arena, home care, hospice, adult daycare. Right now, Amy, chime in. It hasn't passed yet, right? The
No,
amended.
no, it's under
Yeah.
development, being led by the Premier Advocacy Group in New Jersey, Garden State Equality. Shout out to them. They're working on a bill so that every touch point in the continuum of aging from 50, 55 and up, those services will be required to be trained in anti-discrimination and anti-bias strategies and how to incorporate programs in their services to honor and welcome the LGBTQ community. Which is, very necessary. If we can eliminate the barriers to mental and physical health care and social services and community life that has grown up around our intensive political and social dis-ease with the LGBTQ community, we can eliminate a lot of those health and mental health needs and challenges that we're seeing the seniors come in with because they're afraid to access services, or there aren't trained providers in LGBTQ care that have ameliorated that fear and that trauma, and that people are getting their preventative care and people are getting mental health services in safe environments. So it's really, a snowball effect when if everyone in the touch point of senior services, home care, adult daycare, independent living, and other senior service providers, even professional providers, law firms, and accounting firms, if they know what the needs are of this particular client through the lens, we're talking about through the lens of the LGBTQ experience, they'll be able to serve them better.
Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
So one of the things to then think about is how to get the ball rolling. How do you implement a training process? And what we can recommend is if you do contact us, we would then be able to make an assessment as to what strategy and what approach to take. For organizations that can't afford the training, because unfortunately the legislation never included funding for training. It just made a mandate for it, but it's an unfunded mandate. The foundation, its mission is to raise money in order to, to be able to help those organizations that can't afford it, and those that can then would pay for the training. But we can help you kind of figure out strategies for being able to do this. Currently, it's mandated only for the long-term care facilities, but we know that other entities, especially home care, is going to be coming up shortly as the next stage in this process.
So
So
screenshot this slide so you all have our contact information.
at this point, I think we can take questions if there's things that you want to know about the LGBTQ older adult community, and we can just, give a brief mini lecture. I didn't really want to give a lecture about the older adult population, but we can answer some questions and see what your thoughts are as in a discussion for the rest of the time that we have in this group.
Can you unshare your screen so we can see everyone?
Oh, did I unshare? Sorry. I always forget that.
Yeah, thanks.
There we go. Thank you for that heads up.
So please take yourself off mute. Let's have a conversation about, what your thinking is about the need for training and increasing the capacity and competency of older adult social service systems in the state.
I have a question. How do you deal with seniors with internalized homophobia? They don't want any attention, called to that. How do you handle that?
It's not an easy process. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and so yes, you need to recognize that people are products of their environment, and when you're working with people who are closed off to having open LGBTQ plus populations, remember, a lot of the people that stigmatize the community are the very peers in these facilities, right? So there's reasons why LGBTQ older adults are reluctant to necessarily come out. Boundaries essentially is creating that. Basically, you can't change their minds and hearts, but what you can do is monitor the behaviors. So if they say things that are offensive, they get called out on it. They get reminded. You make certain that there are rules of conduct that are agreed upon, and that it's a zero tolerance in terms of the behavior actions. And zero tolerance doesn't necessarily mean you yell at them and shun them and things like that. Zero tolerance means, to me at least, that you don't allow it to go unchecked. Meaning if somebody says something, does something, you do need to voice support for the LGBTQ older adult. You make certain you bring aside the one that's showing vitriol, and you talk about in ways that can at least ameliorate the situation in that moment. It is not an easy thing to do. So by no means am I suggesting that it's a once and done deal. You may have to have the same conversation over and over with residents, but eventually they don't want to have to sit with you and keep hearing it. So they'll start to curb their own verbalizations.
May I interject for 1 second? in part of our training, David often talks about how the older adults in communities with LGBTQ peers are the same older adults who might have harassed and bullied LGBTQ peers in high school. So we're putting all these people in a community together, and those feelings may not have changed. There are cognitive issues that may create more emotional response than intellectual responses to stimuli. So it's very, very important that the residents, the colleagues, the other clients also are trained with specific fun and engaging programs that we've developed to help those peers understand more about the LGBTQ community, be able to identify people they know and love who might be part of the community, to desensitize that experience. So we never suggest that leadership or providers change the culture of their organization in a vacuum. It must include residents, it must include the clients, and it must include their chosen or biological families that provide them support.
Thank you for that. I mean, it really is an important point that it's not just the providers that need training, it's the community.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts and questions about the topic of education on LGBTQ sensitivity? Yes, Riley?
Hi, from PhD social work at Rutgers. I was wondering, this might be a question you don't have an answer to, and that's fine. What is the general guidelines for handling later life transition or other such aspects of the LGBT experience?
Transition in terms of the transgender community, or transition meaning coming out?
As in the transgender community, the non-binary community, any such basic role switching, whether that be, more masculine lesbian identities or more effeminate queer identities, just general identity transitioning that takes place over the course of developing the queer identity.
That is not an area of expertise for me. So I'm not really able to speak to that. What I can say is if there are medical thoughts about transition in terms of medical care and gender affirming care, WPATH would be the place to look for, to see if there's any updates for ideas about transitioning later in life. I don't know if there's research. I would presume there is, but it's not really what we do. What we're talking more about systems of care to help them understand, well, what are the rules that you need to do to make certain it's safe for trans and non-binary seniors. But the statistics of the spectrum of gender expression, it's not something that I can speak to, unfortunately.
But we've recently received new data that we'll be updating our decks with on the transgender experience. What we do talk about is the requirements of the legislation, which is really a piece of legislation that's being copied by other like-minded states, that if somebody goes into care and services and has already prescribed services, hormonal therapy, or prescribed transition surgeries, the provider and the long-term care facility must help that resident have access to those services. And likewise, if they are prescribed once they're in care through their mental health or physical health providers to be afforded transition therapy, medication, and even surgery, that those services are required to be made available to them.
Yeah, that's what the systems, Riley. That's what I was talking about. We can't speak to what you're talking about is the psychological processing of transition as an older adult. That's not the area. We don't train on the psychosocial aspects of transition.
But the questions have come up. We've had a question from an administrator who asked us how they deal with a staff member who is gender nonconforming and fluid in expression from day to day. And what are they supposed to do? And our advice is there's nothing to do. You call that staff member by the name that they choose, and residents will get used to interfacing with that person as who they are. So, focusing on there's nothing to be done, to ameliorate that. That is not an abnormal human experience. So try to educate providers that they're just strategies to interface and respect to be given. It is an ongoing challenge. Communities have not yet seen a preponderance of transgender residents and clients, but they are seeing more each year, and we want to ensure that organizations are training their mental health providers in clinical strategies to serve the whole community, the LGBTQIAAPP+ community.
Amy, we have 5 minutes. I'd like to take Emily's question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree to like 2 minutes. I'm monitoring time. I'm so glad to be here to have an opportunity to thank you directly for your work and for featuring it as part of this. I wanted to just ask, we talk in our age-friendly research team at Rutgers a lot around practice change and advocacy and leadership and outreach and continuing education to improve practices. And I was just going to ask for brief reflections on, in your leadership capacities, your experiences of trying to change the practices of longtime LGBTQ community organizations and leaders to think more about aging. And then on the flip side, trying to change the practices of aging people in the aging space to think more about LGBTQ. And do you find them equally exciting and challenging, or more leverage in one versus the other, just to kind of reflect on that?
When it comes to LGBTQ organizations, my experience is that the organizations know that they need to start focusing in on aging. There are thriving older adult support programs in many of the centers in New Jersey. Hudson Pride Center is one of the organizations that I also work for as their clinical director, and they have a Rainbow Elders support group. So I know that aspect is there. The problem is funding, because funding senior programs is not as sexy as youth programs. And so a lot of the grant fundings, when you go to foundations, are really more about youth than they are about seniors. But the organizations know that this is something they have to do. When it comes to the senior areas, they do recognize that there's an issue, but they also aren't really thinking about it, because there aren't, into their experience, very many older adults that they're coming into contact with that are out to warrant them putting resources in there. I've talked to daycare programs that have said that they've tried, but no one shows up when they have an LGBTQ support group. And so they try once, and if it doesn't succeed, they